What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And a question I'm posed with all the time is, who's your favorite family to talk about when it comes to the mafia? I very rarely have no issue saying it. It's the Bonanno crime family. I've always been enthralled by the history of that group. And quite recently, one of the patriarchs of the Bonanno crime family would die at the age of 80. Say what you want about Joseph Big Joey Massino, but outside of Joe Bonanno, he was the most transcendent person to ever rule the family. He took them through a lot of tough waters in the early 80s. He rose from associate to soldier to captain to a longtime boss of the nation's most powerful mafia. At one point in the early 2000s, Genevieve's Capo Baldi Longo would be secretly recorded by an informant. He would say, in regards to Joe Massino, that at that point in New York, there were two very powerful families. His family, the Genovese family, and Joe's family. Joe Massino took the Bonanno family from a dysfunctional mess to, again, the most powerful family in New York. We remember him most for his defection in becoming the first individual as a boss to cooperate against his family. Today, we're going to get in not to Joey Massino's full life. I've done that before. It was one of the first shows I did when I started this show in 2021. But we're going to get in to some of the things we would learn about his very interesting cooperation. What did the life of the mafia look like from Joe Massino's eyes? Also, at the end of the video, I will discuss where Joey Massino was in the late stages of his life and the very interesting location he spent most of his cooperation in. The story of Joey Massino next on the sit down. Joe Massino was born in 1943. And one of the first things I would like to mention is Joe Massino's wife. Joe Massino met his future wife, Josephine Vitale, in 1956. It is said that Massino and Vitale were essentially teenagers when they had met, and by 17 in 1960, the two would marry. Now, Josephine Massino is still alive today and is said to still live in the home that her and Massino lived in Howard Beach, Queens. Now, one of the first things we would actually learn about Joe Massino is, according to him, we would find out that history tells us that Joe Massino, his first kind of entrance into the life was through Phil Rastelli. And that's actually not true. According to Massino, he actually would not meet Phil Rastelli until 1972 or 1973. But before this, Massino had been very involved with the mafia. We would know that in the 60s, Massino was a hijacker. He was a loan shark. He was a bookmaker. And he was doing a lot of business out of lunch wagons. He was involved with the Union Mobile Lunch Truck Association, and he would supply not just sandwiches and soups and chips and other lunch items to union and non-union workers, but he was also running a loan sharking operation out of the lunch trucks. He would eventually corner that trade. And in and around 1972, according to Massino, he would meet Philip Rusty Rastelli. Now, he would say that in 1973, Rastelli would have a party at his home in Brooklyn. He would then invite Massino into the yard and inform him that he would be placed on record under Rastelli. Now, again, history tells us that Joey Massino knew Rastelli for years, and that's not exactly true. Now, one thing that Massino would keep from Rastelli, in belief that he probably thought this wouldn't be a good thing that Rastelli knew it, but Joey Massino, his first murder would allegedly take place in the late 60s, where it is said he was actually the shooter of a Bonanno associate called Tommy Zumo. In 1969, it's alleged that at the age of 26, Joey Massino would kill Zumo in an apartment building lobby. He would eventually be asked by Rastelli about this, and Massino would claim that he said he had no idea what had happened to Zumo and that it likely probably wouldn't be good, though he thought Rastelli possibly knew he was involved but didn't push. Now, Joe Massino would say by 1975, when the books would open, that he was proposed by Rastelli for membership, but that Massino decided that he didn't think he really needed to be made because he was associated with Rastelli, and that he said he needed pushing by Rastelli to actually accept induction. Massino would not be one of the first people inducted when the books opened in 75. Massino would actually get made in 1977. He would be made in a ceremony alongside people like JB and Delicato and Anthony Spiro. Now, Massino would say the first person that he would essentially operate under on behalf of Rastelli was Bonanno Capo, an old school guy, Nicholas Nicky Glasses Marangello. He would say that at one point he was also an associate under Marangello and that they were both pretty close, him, Rastelli, and Marangello. Now, upon his induction into the Bonanno crime family, Joseph Massino would say that he was around all sorts of guys and reported to many different people. He would say he initially reported to Marangello, and then he directly reported to what he called the boss of the family, Carmine Galanti, for about 6 months. And then he was in the crew of Phil Lucky Giacone, and then placed in the crew of James Galanti, who was related to Carmine Galanti. Massino would say, though, throughout the mid to late 70s until the death of Carmine Galanti, he would secretly be reporting to Rastelli, who was in prison at the time, and he would regularly go and meet Rastelli. Now, the interesting thing about the Bonanno family, and this has always been a point of contention, in the late 70s, who was the actual boss? And there's a lot of confusion even in Massino's testimony. He would say that at one point he believed that Galanti was the boss, but that he also believed that Rastelli was the boss. Massino would discuss that, it was always kind of wondered. He said he would meet Rastelli only a week or two after being made, and that he was confused and believed Galanti was the official boss. Massino would also say that Rastelli would clarify that he himself was the boss, not Galanti. Now, we're led to believe that we don't really know who the boss was. My thought is Galanti was. Now, at one point, Galanti was the boss, and Galanti appeared to have started asserting himself as the new official boss in June of 77. Now, Joe Massino would also say that both Rastelli and Galante were claiming to be the boss. So it's always the question. One group wanted it, one group wanted it. I believe that for the most part, in 77, really until 79, Galanti was probably, and he was the one on the street, he was the one making the decisions. My thought is. Now, Joe Massino, when it came to the murder of Carmine Galanti, he would say that he was not directly involved in the murder in any way, but that he had known about the murder previous to when it was going to happen. And he would say that in July of 1979, when Galanti was taken out, that he was notified of the death by Brooklyn Capo, Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano. He would say that Napolitano would come by a deli that he was at and inform him that Galanti was gone. So this would kind of, in lieu, lead to, down the road, Rastelli getting the boss title in the early 80s. Now, once, according to Massino, Galanti is killed, almost immediately, he is made a captain in the family. So Massino is made in 77. He's made a capo about 2 years later. So quick rise. And, once Galanti's taken out, people are pushed back, they're demoted, and the new kind of faction that's loyal to Rastelli is given all the top tier positions. And by this point, Rastelli's in and out of prison. Joey Massino is quickly ascended to near the top of the family. Now, one thing that I found interesting is Joe Massino would say that for a period of time between 1980 and 1983, he would recognize that the boss of the family was a Sicilian zip called Sally Fruits Ferrugia, and they had become close. And that Ferrugia had a faction of zips, which includes Sicilians and Italians, and not just Sicilians and Italians. He would say, Massino, that not only was he close to Ferrugia, but that other members of that faction included Sonny Black, Sal Catalano, Gerlando, George from Canada, Shasha, as well as Stevie Beef Canone. So it was more of a hierarchy kind of grouping of people that ran the Bonanno crime family until Rastelli got out in 83. But on the street, the acting decision maker was Sally Fruits Ferrugia. Now, in his testimony, Joseph Massino would talk very openly about the three capos hit. Now, I'm not going to get into the three capos and what actually happened per se, but as we know, it's very important in kind of understanding what Massino said about the certain situation, and that he had gotten word through certain people and other families that the three capos, Sonny Redendelicato, Dominic Trinchera, and Philip Giancone, were planning to take over the family because the official boss of the family, Phil Rastelli, was in prison. Now, Massino would say that he, alongside Sal Ferrugia and George from Canada, Shasha, would personally have a meeting with Paul Castellano and Carmine Persco, indicating that they had planned to move on the three capos and that it was basically instructed of, hey, you got to go to them before they get to you. Do what you got to do. And Massino would also discuss that in the hit that day, certain shooters that were involved were Sal Vitale, Vito Rizzuto, Frank Navarra, an old-timer called Gaspare Bonaventure, as well as a person we could gauge as Vinny from Canada. And we don't exactly know who Vinny from Canada is, but I have an idea. And we likely think that most of the people involved were connected to Vito Rizzuto, namely George from Canada, Shasha. Now, we also would learn, and this is common knowledge, that John Gotti's crew actually was involved in disposing some of the three capos. And that's something that Joey Massino would include in his testimony as well. Now, Joey Massino would also talk in court and in his testimony about the Donnie Brasco situation. And this is where we learned some really interesting things about why certain individuals were killed in the early 80s. And it's not necessarily because of the Donnie Brasco situation. Now, Joey Massino would say that in regards to the film Donnie Brasco, we couldn't get his opinion on it because in court, someone objected and we weren't able to hear what he thought of the film, because when Joey Massino testified, this was long after Donnie Brasco, the film, was released. And I know a lot of people probably would agree with this. I would have liked to have known what Joey Massino thought of the film. One thing we know is Joey Massino was not featured in the film. Now, when we look at films about mobsters, a lot of the time, people that are living in mob films are not generally discussed because that would mean they would have to pay them and get their life, their naming rights. And Joey Massino probably wasn't named because of it. Now, Massino would claim that when Sonny Black was killed in 1981, that it wasn't totally because of the Donnie Brasco situation. Massino essentially says that Sonny Black was killed because they were viewing him as a possible worry as far as leadership. Sonny Black had a huge crew. He was very respected. And the one thing that we would learn about Joey Massino's power is he recognized when people were not necessarily subservient, but trying to benefit their own. And one thing about being a boss is if you cannot recognize people coming up that are willing to take the crown from you, you are not going to last very long. That's one thing we learned about Carmine Persico. If he viewed you as a threat, he took you out. Joey Massino was the same way. Now, Massino would also say that in terms of other people killed during the 80s and in the early 80s, that it wasn't necessarily why they were killed. We would venture to believe that history tells us that Anthony Mira was killed because of his connection and introducing Donnie Brasco to the Bonanno crime family. Now, according to Massino, he would say that Tony Mira's uncle, Alan Barada, was provided with a document stating that Anthony Mira was actually an informant for the DEA. Now, at one point, we would also hear regularly in conversation with Lefty Guns Ruggiero and Donnie Brasco that he would say regularly on the record that Anthony Mira was, quote, a stool pigeon. Now, a lot of people believe that it was just Lefty talking shit because he didn't like Anthony Mira, but there is a lot of reason to believe that Mira possibly was a government informant, and that's why he was killed. So a lot of these early murders in the 80s that we think were related to Donnie Brasco may have been important, but there were other reasons why Mira and Sonny Black were killed, according to Joseph Massino. Now, in the mid-80s, Joey Massino is a quasi acting boss. He's the underboss per se. Rastelli is the main official boss, but he has his eyes and ears on the street. Rastelli fought health issues and prison for a lot of the 80s and even in the 70s as well, as we talked about. But Massino would have to deal with his own legal issues. We would know that he had to go on the lam at some point for racketeering. He ultimately would have to do some time in prison in the late 80s into the early 90s. And Massino would provide a pretty funny thought that I wanted to share with all of you. Massino would say that in the late 80s, when he was in prison with some very heavy hitters. Massino would say that people in prison with him included Paul Vario, Matty the Horse Aniello, Fat Tony Salerno, and Angelo Quack Quack Ruggiero Sr. Now, Joey Massino would boast that in prison, they had a guard on the take and that he would regularly provide them with cold cuts, shrimp, other seafood. And what I found funny about all the four people that I just indicated is they're all very large individuals, right? I mean, Joey Massino was in the 300s. Fat Tony Salerno was likely in his 300s. I mean, Paul Vario was a large individual. Quack Quack was a large individual. Matty the Horse was a large individual. Imagine how many pounds of cold cuts they would need to be provided with each week. I mean, it's funny to think about, quite honestly, because literally every person I named was quite large, if we're being honest. I'd have to wonder what the court thought when Joey Massino discussed all the cold cuts that he was getting in prison. It's kind of funny to think about. Now, Massino would say by the late 80s, he would be approached in prison by a Colombo capo, Andrew Mush Russo, and he would be told by Mush Russo that he was actually named official boss in the late 80s, which is interesting. By this point, if you know anything about Rastelli, in the late 80s, early 90s, he has a lot of health problems. He would actually die in 1991 while Massino was in prison, but that he was indicated by Russo that the commission would appoint him as new boss of the Bonanno crime family. So between 1977, when he gets made, and by the late 80s, Joe Massino, due to the fact that he did a lot of good things for the Bonanno family in the 80s, he was the calm on the streets. He was the guy that took them through rough waters. And what he also did was, for the most part, the Bonanno family was not very much included in the commission trials. And what this would create is by the early 90s, the Bonannos are the big organization in New York because they were, for the most part, untouched by racketeering convictions in the 80s. Joseph Massino would be released from prison on supervised release in 1992. And to get through the supervised release period, he'd pass messages through his brother-in-law, Salvatore Handsome Sal Vitali, who was his quasi-underboss on the streets. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Joey Massino and some of the things that he discussed about rules that he would institute as he took the family over. According to Massino, when a member was inducted into the Bonanno crime family, they were instructed that they were now part of the Massino crime family, but that when other people would ask as far as members, they were the Bonanno crime family. So they didn't change the name, they didn't push for a change, but members knew that when they were inducted, they were called the Massino crime family. But for outsiders and other families, they were still the Bonanno family. We could think that also had to do with, pushing, kind of blame that it's an entity, it's not my entity. Now, Joe Massino would also have a rule when you wanted to refer to him, similar to the one that Vincent the Chin Gigante had. You were never to utter his name. You were to touch your ear when referring to him. As we know as well, in 1992, Joe Massino starts adding different captains. He starts growing his territory. He realizes that the Bronx has no captain, so he institutes Patty from the Bronx DeFilippo as his new Bronx guy. Now, Joe Massino would say that in and around his release from prison, this is when he becomes notified of who Vincent Vinny Gorgeous Basciano was, and that this was around the early 90s. He said that he would hear of Basciano in 1990 when Vitali would say that Basciano was, quote, a good guy and a workhorse. And this was, if you know anything about Vinny Gorgeous, we did a video on him here. This is when we learned that he's probably inducted in and around this time. Now, around 1997, Patty from the Bronx DeFilippo would tell Massino that Basciano was, quote, a good earner and a good man. And that if Massino needed Basciano to do work, Patty said that Basciano was a very capable killer. Now, Basciano would regularly visit Massino at his restaurant, Casablanca. And one thing Joey Massino did is he was very good at continuing to grow membership, right? He wanted to make sure that the family could operate without him. He instituted many capable capos that were subservient to him. And what he also did was he wanted to make sure that capos could do making ceremonies. They could keep the family flowing. He recognized that down the road, he would need other people to handle business, i.e. Tony Graziano, Tony Urso, Sal Vitali. Everybody was very capable. Now, Joe Massino would also have an interesting rule that no family members below consigliere could discuss murders, and that you were not allowed to discuss murders amongst each other or with other families. Massino would also have a rule that the family exclusively would bury victims. You were not to leave victims on the street. Now, one thing that I found interesting about that is in 1999, when George from Canada is whacked, they didn't bury him. They threw him on the street, and that was to make the look like they were not involved, because it was regularly known that the Bonanno crime family did not put victims in the street. They buried their victims or got rid of victims. And it was a smart, for them, law enforcement tactic. Now, Joe Massino would also say that every Christmas, each member, which around this time was around 150 made members of the Mafia as far as the Bonanno family, Massino would say that at every Christmas, each member was required to give $1,000 to the boss. But they were kind in saying that if you were regarded as a broke member, you didn't have to pay the $1,000. Now, how many of the 150 estimated members were considered broke? Probably not many. According to Massino, he would say that around Christmas regularly, he would bring in about $150,000 in tribute payments. So you have to wonder, who were the broke members? It was actually quite common knowledge that Massino would say that one member that did not pay was Chubby Maiorino, which is interesting. He was regarded as a brokester. Now, some of the other testimony that I found interesting regarding the family itself was that just some of the things that Massino would also say about just membership in the Mafia, etc. Massino would say at one point that one of the reasons for circulating proposed lists in the case of a member being inducted is that you could be knocked down for either being a child molester, which is normal, or that you could also be shelved for things like being drunk in public, being a nuisance or an idiot, things of that nature. Massino would also say that he attended nearly 70 induction ceremonies in his career, and that he didn't actually make 70 people, but he was present for about 70 induction ceremonies. He would also say that any captain can have anywhere from 2 to 20 members, and a member could have up to 50 associates. Now, again, we would have to think that that's just more of estimates. He would also say that the family operated in Queens, Brooklyn, Montreal, California, Vegas, Connecticut, and New Jersey. So some of those are kind of interesting in terms of Las Vegas. Who was operating in Las Vegas in the 90s? That's kind of an interesting thing. One name that I do know of that was said to be operating in Vegas at the time was a made member in the Bonanno crime family called Vincent Vinny Green Faraci. He was said to be involved in Vegas at the time. He is the son of Johnny Green Faraci, a Brooklyn longtime member of the family. Now, Massino would say at one point, he would discuss Dominic Sacali. Now, I bring Dom up due to the fact that he is on YouTube. Massino would say that Dom Sacali was originally, as far as he knew, an associate of Big Ernie Muscarella of the Genovese family. Now, Vinny Basciano would ask Massino for permission to speak with Muscarella and get permission for Sacali to be released to the Bonanno crime family. In and around 2000, Basciano would tell Massino that he wanted Sacali because Sacali was, quote, a good worker, meaning killer. Sacali would meet Basciano after doing prison time with Bruno Indelicato, which we know is common knowledge due to the fact that Sacali has talked about that on his YouTube channel. Now, in 2001, this is kind of interesting. Sacali would drive Basciano, according to Massino, to a meeting. Basciano wanted to introduce Massino to Sacali. Now, Massino would point out to Basciano that Massino didn't bring anyone else to the meeting and told Basciano that in the future, he not explicitly bring anyone and declined to not meet Sacali. Basciano would apologize for bringing Sacali around. So Massino was super, super cognizant of new people, law enforcement, wiretap, surveillance, everything. And that if you explicitly mentioned him, like other bosses, that was a killable offense. Now, look, we're not going to go through the indictments and all the stuff that happened with Joey Massino. We know that he would be indicted in 2003. We would know that he was found guilty in 2004, and he faced the death penalty. One of the murders that he was involved with was ordering the murder of George from Canada Shasha, which means that he would fall under the death penalty requirement and that he could actually get the death penalty. We would know that once he is found guilty, he also would face a $10 million forfeiture, not only facing the death penalty, but the prospect that his wife and children would have nothing. He claims that is when he decided to cooperate. Now, what we do know is Joey Massino would then be wired up and he would be placed in the bullpen with Vincent Basciano. And one of the things we would glean that Massino would get on tape was the plan for Basciano to kill a U.S. prosecutor. That was, at the time, U.S. prosecutor Greg Andre. Now, Massino would testify, according to him, that he thought Mr. Andres was really responsible for, according to him, pretty much destroying the Bonanno family. And he would say that Andres brought about 100 prosecutions against members of the Bonanno family, and that he believed he was going to be prosecuted and all sorts of things next. Now, Mr. Massino would say on the stand that Basciano would approach him about possibly killing Andres, and that Andres regularly went to a restaurant on First Avenue in Manhattan called Campagnola, which is where they could take him out. Now, under cross-examination by defense lawyer George Gletzer, Mr. Massino would also acknowledge that he had been upset during one trial when evidence was revealed by Andres that he had an extramarital affair while his wife was in the courtroom, and that Mr. Massino considered that it was a cheap shot, according to him, by Andres. But he would also testify that he had never actually wanted anyone to harm Mr. Andres. Now, ultimately, for Basciano, he wouldn't have to deal with the Andres stuff, but he got Basciano talking about all sorts of stuff on tape, including the Pizzola hit, all sorts of stuff. When it comes to the death of Joey Massino, there is one person that is probably quite happy about it. It's Vinny Basciano. We'll wait to see if Basciano ever gets a new trial in his 2 life sentences. We'll have to wait and see. One thing we would also get from the Wired for Sound moment involving Basciano and Massino was comments about the lifestyle of the Mafia. At one point, Basciano would say, quote, "I'm a hoodlum. I'm a tough guy. Whatever happens, happens. Let's go. In another wiretap, Massino would discuss the demise of his Mafia family, saying, quote, "We were okay until I got pinched. We were on top of the world." Joey Massino was 80 years old at the time of his death. From what I understand, according to a source that I discussed with, he had many health problems. And Frank Fiordolino would tell me, who once knew Joey Massino, that even in the mid 2000s, Joey Massino had a ton of health issues, from diabetes to high blood pressure to obesity. All those cold cuts really caught up to him. And Fiordolino would tell me that he remembers in prison, Joey Massino couldn't even tie his own shoes. That's how out of shape and in poor health that he was. Joey Massino would live for about 15 years in secrecy in the witness protection program. The family of Massino would say that he lived at one point in his early defection in Florida, and at one point lived in Ohio. And what I find so fascinating about the lives of these people is after all of this ends. At one point, Joseph Massino was the biggest criminal organizer in New York City. He was on top of the world, as he said. Imagine living in a little town in Ohio, and you're at a restaurant and you look to your left and you see an old big guy who kind of looks like a mobster eating some scungili. And you recognize him and you say, wow, is that Joe Massino? Imagine being on top, having everything, and in a quick week or two, you're in Ohio somewhere, living like everybody else. Joe Massino truly was alone. From what I understand, his family lived in New York without him. Joe Massino would die in New York, surrounded by his family and his daughters. Say what you want about Joe Massino. We all know he's a rat. But he should be regarded truly, while on the street, as one of the greatest bosses in the history of the Mafia. Because on the street he was. But we have to discuss his historical defection. What were the last 15 years like for Joe Massino? I'd have to figure they weren't real good. At the time of his death, Joe Massino was 88 years old. These guys are dying, and the only people that care are people like us. Joe Massino's death really wasn't mentioned much in the press, and if it was a small couple of paragraphs. To go from on top to the bottom, it's the life of the mob today. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.